Hey guys, I wanted to make this video. If you didn't attend the meeting that I had on Zoom, this is to help you out with this assignment, the assignments that you had this week. So this is a resource on this side of the screen that you have for your assignments. I recommend that you use it because it just breaks down what all the different uh, biases are. Media bias is something that you are exposed to every single day of your life. It's not always easy to see what type of bias you're being exposed to, but you can definitely see that it's biased. So, what we want to work on is how to see what type of bias it is. The two most commonly used types of bias are omission and spin. Omission, really easy to pinpoint because omission is just leaving stuff out. So this one says bias by omission. This type of bias is used when a media source purposefully leaves out information which supports or favors one party or viewpoint. This can occur within one particular story or over a period of time in multiple stories by a given source. Each media outlet typically favors either the liberal or the conservative viewpoint and omits certain information accordingly. So on your work the other day, let's see if it'll load. Yeah, on this one, number 3 and number 11, those were bias by omission. So let's look at one of those. Let's look at number 3. An Atlanta news station recently ran a story about an inner city school with students achieving test scores well above the average for schools of the same demographics. The story challenged all similar schools in the area to step up their game and accused teachers in other buildings of laziness. A few weeks later, a follow-up story aired on another network revealing that the school had adopted a longer school day and had received a $50,000 grant for improved technology and resources, which none of the other schools had access to. So we can see in this example the bias by omission because the original news source didn't mention anything about the advantages the school got over all the other area schools. They left that out. That is extremely biased. So number 3 is bias by omission. Hopefully that one makes more sense. The second type of bias that is most commonly used is bias by spin. You ever had somebody twist one of your stories? You ever had somebody put words into your mouth? That's spinning. When people spin a story to make it fit their own narrative, it's bias by spin. So when a story features only one interpretation of a story, it totally excludes the other. This is bias by spin. This can include suggestive or misleading photos, an obvious bias in the reporter's or news source's tone, or anything else that misleads the story's audience. It's not necessarily lying because the information they're putting out there is factual. However, it can be taken out of context. It can be spun to basically taken out of context and used to fit somebody else's narrative. That's bias by spin. Okay. On your homework, it was number 2, number 5. Yeah, number 2 and number 5. So let's look at number 2. Okay. Recently, a 17-year-old Louisiana boy made national headlines when he was accused of the brutal beating of a neighbor. While most networks frequently showed the suspect in photos with known gang affiliates, along with his mugshot and a photo of him posing with a gun in his hand, HRC News often showed photos of him as a young child singing in his church choir, as well as a poignant photo of him kneeling by his sick grandmother's bedside after she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. So we can see how the first headlines were spinning a story because they were only showing negative photos or photos with negative connotations of this boy, whereas this boy wasn't all bad. He was in church, went to church. He was in the choir. He took care of his grandmother or was by her side whenever she was sick. So when the news didn't report that part, they were spinning a story to fit their narrative, to make this kid look like just a really bad kid with no positive qualities. So that's bias by spin. Okay, the next type, this one was probably the most commonly missed one. I'm going to hide this real quick. Bias by selection of sources. To understand this one, you have to know what a source is. A source is anywhere where you get information. It can be people, experts, it can be websites, newspapers, magazines, articles, journals. Anywhere where you are getting information, those are sources. So bias by selection of sources occurs when a media outlet includes a disproportionate amount of expert sources or witnesses for one party or viewpoint over another. So let's say I'm a reporter and I want to present to you information about some political policy, but I only go talk to Democratic senators, and that's where I'm getting information. Those Democratic senators are my sources. And if I'm only getting that one side from them, that's bias by selection of sources. In order to not be biased, I would have to get the same amount of Republican senators and the same amount of Democratic senators to write my story, to write my information. Okay. So includes a disproportionate amount of expert sources or witnesses for one party or viewpoint over another. If a reporter or journalist interviews one conservative and 4 liberals for the same story, this is an example of bias by selection of sources. If no experts are present, but the reporter uses phrases such as experts say or evidence suggest in favor of one viewpoint, this is also bias. So on your homework, numbers 4 and 8 were bias by selection of sources. So I'm going to do number 4. The National Network plans to air a 2-hour special on animal testing. The special will feature an interview with a cancer survivor who was able to shrink her tumors thanks to a new drug that had been tested on rats. And the network also plans to interview the CEO of Proudman Industries, which has made millions on its Quick Grow shampoo, a product whose unique formula was shown to increase the rate of hair growth in rabbits by 15%. The segment will conclude by showing footage of a doctor making great strides in Alzheimer's research by testing on chimps. So this is bias by selection of sources because this program is only going to feature people who have seen positive effects of animal testing. They're not showing the negative effects of animal testing at all. They're not picking those sources. So that's bias by selection of sources. Okay, the next type. This is a really easy type to identify because labeling is just name calling. Whenever you're giving somebody an unfair label, bias by labeling. There are 2 forms of this type of bias. One involves using more extreme words to characterize one party over another. For example, using liberal with one party, but using ultra-conservative with the other. That one right there is bias because the true forms of that are liberal and conservative. That's what they are. By saying liberal and ultra-conservative, we're giving the conservatives an extra unfair name, which makes it biased. Another type involves the media referring to a source as an expert or using another favorable term without identifying the individual as liberal or conservative. So, okay. I can call myself an expert on rocket science. But let's say, okay, and maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. You don't know for sure. But let's say that I lean very, very, very conservatively. So my information is going to lean towards the conservative side. That's still really biased because it does not present the liberal point of view. It's only giving that one side, and I'm using that in the name of an expert. So that one's a little bit harder to see, but typically if you're being called a name, that is bias by labeling. The next one, oh, hold on. Let's go to the homework. Bias by labeling, that was number 6 and 12. Let's look at number 6. An interview with 2 popular presidential candidates, news anchor Sally Slander pointed out the Republican candidate's firm but sensible conservative stance on gun control, while referencing the ultra-liberal Democratic candidate's views as radical and far left. We can see that the liberal is being called ultra-liberal and also radical and also far left. Those are unfair names, and that is bias. Okay. Now, bias by story selection. Okay, so we know what stories are. They are what the news article, it's what they're reporting on. It can be in video format. It can be an article, what they're typing and writing out, anything. So it's the stories that they're telling. When a media source presents an unbalanced number of stories which favor one party's viewpoint over another's, this is bias by story selection. This type of bias also occurs when the media source ignores one party's take on a particular issue and shows only one side of the argument. So again, we're getting one-sided information here, but this time it has to do with the stories being presented. If you're handed a newspaper and every single story in that newspaper is for, I don't know, some political stance, it doesn't matter what, it's all for that, and it doesn't show any stories against it, that's still biased because they're only showing one side. And they're doing that through the stories that they're telling. Okay? That's story selection. Numbers. Oh, nope, just number 7. Number 7 is story selection. The national news in the months prior to the presidential election featured on its front page a variety of high-profile articles. These articles included an analysis of yearly prison costs which supported the use of capital punishment, a feature on the potential savings achievable by a cut to welfare funding, and a story on the educational milestones achieved by cities using school vouchers. So we're seeing one-sided stories being presented on the same source. So that's story selection. And the last one, bias by placement. Bias by placement occurs if a story or viewpoint which favors one agenda over another is given a more prominent location in a piece of media, or when within a story, one viewpoint is mentioned much earlier than another. In a balanced news story, both viewpoints are mentioned in roughly the same place. So where information is placed is really, really important. If it's at the top, if it's at the front, if it's really big and bold, they're wanting you to see it. If it's a video, if it's at the very, very beginning, or if it's the title of the video, they want you to see it. If it's a print source and it's at the very, very bottom of the page, it's in small print, or maybe it's several pages into a story, or on a website, if it's at the bottom or you have to link a couple times to get to it, people don't want you to see that stuff. They don't want you to focus on it. This is bias by placement. So if it's really, really big and bold, they want you to see it. But if they're trying to hide it, they don't want you to see it. And it can be biased either way. On your homework, it was number 1 and number 10. Number 1 and number 10 are biased by placement. So let's look at number 1. A national newspaper recently featured a story on gun control. The publication, widely known to favor conservative viewpoints, quoted several well-known politicians and gun lobbyists. Quotes by Senators Robert Right-Wing and Carl Conservative were featured prominently through the article. Near the end of the story, almost as an afterthought, a small acknowledgement of the increase in mass shootings with a relevant quote from Larry Liberal was included. So you can see that this is bias by placement because they're placing all of the conservative stuff first, and then the very, very last thing was one thing from Larry Liberal. Bias by placement. Okay, so that was a rundown of all of the types of bias again. I gave you the answers for this worksheet, so if you can redo it if you want to. I'm probably just going to give you credit for doing it. But this is the one that matters. So the one you have for today, let me back that up just a little bit. This is set up where the article first, right here, it tells you what the situation was, what actually happened. Then in the middle here, right here, this is how the media presented the same situation to the world. You need to see or try to determine how the media is being biased here. Okay. So here up here is what actually happened. Here is how the media presented it to the world. How is the media being biased? Again, there's a rundown of the situation. So number one, you probably should answer this one in yes, ma'am, because you need to have a really good reason as to why you think it is the bias that you chose. Here's what I'll do for this one. If you give me a really solid answer, like you've really thought about it, you picked your type of bias, you've really explained why you think it is the type of bias that it is, and that information makes sense, your explanation and reasoning makes sense, I'll probably just give it to you even if it's wrong. But if you give me a wrong answer and you don't have a very good explanation for it, I'm not going to give it to you. Okay. So I really want you to try to explain this. Why do you think it's the type of bias that you chose? The other two, you don't necessarily have to do those in yes, ma'am, but I do want you to write them with complete sentences. If you've already turned this in, I'm not going to look at them until Saturday, tomorrow. If you want to unsubmit that, redo it, and then resubmit it, that's fine. Go ahead and do that. Okay, if you have any other questions for me, don't write in the comment section on your worksheets because I don't get notified when you comment there. Please text me. I get notified right away when you text me. Okay? Any other questions you have, just let me know. All right, I don't know how to stop this now that I hid the thing.